1864, Boston. A boy with no name was admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital, not for care, but to become the subject of an experiment in defying death itself. The winter of that year pressed its leaden weight against the city, a cold that seeped through granite and settled deep in the bones of the living. Inside the hospital's corridors, the air was colder still, sharp with the scents of carbolic acid, lime wash, and the heavy, sweet perfume of ether that clung to wool coats and starched curtains alike. This was a house of suffering made orderly, a place where the chaos of the Civil War was catalogued in neat rows of cots. Wounded soldiers, their bodies carrying the iron of the front, lay beside fever cases drawn from the city's teeming harbor districts and children delivered from Boston's various almshouses, transferred under quiet agreements between institutions that treated poverty as a contagion. It was into this world that he arrived. He crossed the threshold on a bitter January afternoon, with no family to escort him and no letter of parish standing to vouch for his soul. His shoes were worn to paper, his frame was so slight it seemed a strong wind might carry him away, and his eyes were a washed-out, impenetrable gray. The woman who brought him, a matron from the city's house of industry, signed the intake ledger with brisk, detached impatience. To her, he was merely one more mouth passed from one set of walls to another. To the hospital, he was something more valuable, a specimen without attachments, a body without consequence. The admissions clerk, a man named Abernathy, hesitated, his pen hovering over the page. He scratched the boy given name, then crossed it out with a thick, dark line. He tried initials, then smudged them with his thumb until only a blank space remained, an unnerving void in a book built on names. In the right-hand margin, a stamp had already been applied by the overseers of the poor, temporary. It was an administrative category with little legal weight, but in the grim calculus of the ward, it meant this child could be used, loaned, or discarded as the hospital saw fit. This bureaucratic orphanhood was a death sentence, but one that would refuse to be carried out. The ward matron, a woman named Elspeth Fisk, noted the boy's profound silence as he was settled into a cot near the far wall, away from the weak afternoon light. He did not cry, did not ask for his mother, did not even look toward the other patients whose groans and whispers filled the long, high-ceilinged room. He simply lay there, his gray eyes fixed on the water-stained plaster above. When a young house pupil came to check his pulse, the boy offered his wrist without a word. The pupil, a student eager to prove his mettle, recorded the measure twice, frowning as if his own fingers had betrayed him. The pulse was steady, strong, strikingly so for a child who appeared half-starved. He called another student over to confirm it, and they muttered to each other in low tones, their shared disbelief a quiet current in the ward's heavy air. The staff who drifted past his bed saw in him not a child, but a reflection of their own ambitions and fears. Dr. Silas Hale, a surgeon whose desire for professional advancement burned brighter than any gas lamp, saw a unique opportunity. His lectures to the students at Harvard Medical School often lacked the novelty needed to secure a man's reputation. Here, perhaps, was raw material, a subject that could be bent into a paper for the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, a name-making discovery. The pupils, fresh from their classrooms and untested by the true horrors of medicine, saw only the permission implicit in a blank intake card. A subject without family was a subject without inquiry, without letters of complaint, without consequence. Only Mrs. Fisk felt a prickle of unease. She noted the unnerving hollowness of the boy's stare and the way his gray eyes seemed to wait, not for comfort or for cure, but for something else entirely. She saw an unnatural stillness, a patience that did not belong in a child. The culture of the time, however, permitted what a private conscience might have restrained. Medicine was a brutal art, and the war had made it more so. The Civil War had swollen the hospital wards with an endless supply of broken bodies, and the medical establishment had grown accustomed to seeing patients as collections of symptoms, as data points to be studied. Ether had dulled the screams that once haunted these halls. Chloroform had silenced the protests of those beneath the knife. The poor had long been pressed into service as living subjects for the refinement of surgical technique. The difference here was not one of institutional policy, but of profound, unsettling circumstance. The boy's file, as it was first written and then unwritten, contained nothing to suggest he should be spared, no name to anchor him to the world of the living. The intake ledger remains in the hospital's archives, its ink scored and palimpsestic with correction and erasure. What survives on the page is a deliberate absence, a line where a life should be, half erased, penciled over, then rubbed away again. It is the kind of administrative anomaly that would later trouble archivists far more than it ever troubled the administrators who created it. That night, the boy was measured, weighed, and his frail metrics were entered into charts as if his body were already an experiment in waiting. The pupils, under Dr. Hale's watchful eye, tapped at his pulse, timing the beats with the cold precision of watchmakers, nodding each interval as if they expected the numbers to betray some hidden flaw, some weakness they could exploit. But the numbers never wavered. By morning, Dr. Hale gave his first order. It was not for a treatment, not for a cure, but for a test. A simple incision to begin with, he told them, a baseline observation. The boy's admission had never been meant to last, but the hospital was not yet finished with him. And so, the knife was ordered not to heal, but to see what this strange, silent body was made of. They were about to discover it was made of something that defied their understanding of flesh and blood entirely. The boy was placed on a narrow cot beneath the dim arc of a gas lamp, its flame turned low to conserve the ward's precious supply. Outside, a fresh layer of snow pressed against the high, grime-streaked windows, muffling the sounds of the city and encasing the ward in a profound silence. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wax, iodine, and the ever-present fear of infection. Dr. Hale gathered his pupils close, their notebooks open, their quills trembling faintly in the cold air. "This," he announced, his voice a low, confident hum meant to project authority, "is a controlled test of coagulation and tissue repair. Nothing more." The boy did not resist as his thin sleeve was rolled to the elbow. His forearm, pale and almost translucent, lay across the surgeon's palm like a length of birch wood prepared for planning. Hale selected a clean scalpel from his kit, its polished steel edge catching the gaslight in a brief, cold shimmer. Mrs. Fisk stood back, her arms folded tightly across her chest, unwilling to intervene but also unwilling to leave the boy alone with them. She had seen too many routine procedures become something else entirely. The blade met the skin in a shallow, deliberate draw. It was not meant to be a grievous wound, only to open the flesh just so, a thin red line no longer than a finger's breadth. The pupils bent forward, their young faces a mixture of clinical curiosity and morbid eagerness. They were anxious to see how quickly the blood welled, how soon the clotting would begin, how the body would commence its slow, predictable work of mending. One student sketched the first bright flow onto his chart, capturing the initial bead of crimson, while another recorded the precise time allowed from a pocket watch. But the boy did not cry out. His eyes, fixed on the ceiling, did not flicker. His jaw did not clench. And then the impossible began to happen. The wound, which should have remained open for observation, for cleaning, for stitching, began to close itself almost as soon as the scalpel left the flesh. The flow of blood, which should have been steady, slowed, then stopped completely. The edges of the cut, clean and precise, drew together as if pulled by invisible, microscopic sutures. The first sketch was already obsolete. The pupil scratched hurriedly at the paper with his quill, erasing, redrawing the line as a seam rather than a gash, then gave up in frustration. What he was seeing could not be captured in ink. It defied the anatomical charts he had spent years memorizing. Hale frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He leaned closer, his professional composure faltering for the first time. He pressed gently at the line with a sterile probe, expecting to find the tender, yielding flesh of a fresh wound. Instead, he felt only a faint, firm ridge of skin already knitting together. To preserve the appearance of a normal procedure, and perhaps his own authority, Hale stitched a single, perfunctory suture, a black thread against a pale arm. It was, in truth, entirely unnecessary. The wound had sealed itself without his help. He instructed his pupils to mark the procedure as routine, to record that recovery was uncommonly swift, but not to use the word irregular. Still, a tremor of unease slipped through his carefully controlled tone. That night, the nurse on duty, a woman named Miss Albright, entered her notes in the ward log. Her handwriting was neat, her phrasing standard, edges approximated without suppurating. No signs of inflammation. But in the margin, she added a remark that was anything but standard. Suture appears older than its hours. When she changed the dressing at dawn, she found the line had already faded to a pale pink seam. The black thread lay slack against a plane of skin that looked weeks, not hours, into its healing. By the following evening, it was gone entirely. The boy's arm bore nothing but smooth, unbroken skin. The house pupils muttered among themselves in the corridors, their drawings of the wound now bearing evidence of an injury that no longer existed. Their carefully recorded timing tables were contradicted by the living flesh before them. One student, bolder than the rest, suggested reopening the cut for accuracy. Mrs. Fisk, who overheard him, silenced him with a look so sharp it could have drawn blood itself. Though she could not reconcile what she had seen with what she knew of the world, her instincts told her this was a violation that should not be repeated. Dr. Hale paced the length of the ward late into the night, reviewing the charts, tapping his finger against the clock notes. It was not possible. It defied every medical text, every lecture he had ever given. And yet, it had been observed by 5 witnesses and written into 3 separate ledgers. The boy himself offered no explanation. He lay quietly, his eyes open, watching the dance of shadows on the ceiling beams. His pulse, when Mrs. Fisk checked it one last time before extinguishing the main lamp, ticked with the same steady, metronomic beat it had carried upon his arrival, as if the incision had never occurred. For Dr. Hale, this was no longer a simple test. It was a challenge. A shallow cut had told him something medicine could not explain, a story written in disappearing flesh. It was an affront to his knowledge, to his authority. If the knife told one story of impossibility, he reasoned, then chloroform would tell another. He would silence the body, probe its reflexes, and find the mechanism behind this anomaly. The trial began the following night in silence, save for the muted hiss of the gas lamps and the rustle of pupils arranging their notebooks. A new instrument of inquiry was prepared, not of steel, but of vapor. A metal cone, its rim lined with soft gauze, was prepared in the customary fashion. Chloroform, decanted from a small brown vial, was dripped onto the fabric drop by measured drop, spreading its sharp, cloyingly sweet vapor into the cold air of the ward. The boy was told nothing of what was to come. He was simply reclined against the cot's iron frame, his thin chest rising and falling with a rhythm that betrayed no alarm, no anticipation. He watched the proceedings with his usual unnerving calm. The house pupils leaned in, their faces illuminated by the flickering gaslight, eager to witness the delicate, dangerous threshold between waking and insensibility. Chloroform was still a relatively young instrument of medicine, a chemical miracle that had silenced the operating theater's notorious screams. But it was already hailed as both miracle and menace, capable of rendering the most resistant body compliant, but also known to still hearts forever if measured carelessly. Tonight, every movement was to be recorded in dozing logs, every interval of time called out against the ticking of a pocket watch held by the senior pupil. At first, the procedure appeared entirely ordinary. The gauze cone was fitted gently over the boy's nose and mouth. His breathing, audible in the hushed room, slowed. His eyelids fluttered, quivered, and at last seemed to close. One pupil pressed a finger to his pulse. It was steady, softened, exactly as the textbooks described. Dr. Hale, satisfied, lifted a sterile needle, its point sharp. It was meant only to prick the skin just below the surface, a simple test of reflex and sensation to confirm the anesthesia's hold. Mrs. Fisk stood back, her hands folded tightly within her apron, her expression already marked with a profound distaste for the night's work. The needle entered the boy's skin cleanly, and in that precise instant the boy's eyes opened. They did not open with a start or in a daze. They opened with a lucid, chilling clarity, clear gray eyes fixed upon the ceiling beams, unblinking, as if observing the proceedings from a great depth where ether and chloroform could not reach. The pupils froze. One of them dropped his pen, its clatter on the floorboard startlingly loud in the tense silence. Dr. Hale, his face hardening, adjusted the cone. He added more drops of chloroform, saturating the gauze until the vapor spilled visibly from its edges, shimmering in the lamplight. Again, the boy's breathing slowed. Again, his lashes fell, his limbs grew slack, his jaw relaxed. Hale waited longer this time, a full 2 minutes by the pocket watch, until every textbook sign declared the child insensible, a body without a mind. The needle pressed again, this time deeper, meant to provoke some involuntary flinch, some cry of nerve endings that consciousness could not suppress. And once more the eyes opened. Calm, steady, watching. The pupils exchanged uneasy glances. Their confidence began to fray. One muttered that perhaps reflexes were subdued, though consciousness somehow remained. Another scribbled furiously into the dozing log, his nervous haste betraying his confusion, anesthesia achieved in appearance, not in fact. Dr. Hale said nothing, his jaw tight. The test was repeated. The cone was replaced, the gauze freshened, the dose increased to a level that would have felled a grown man. Each attempt produced the same maddening paradox. The body would surrender, breathing would slow, muscles would slacken, but the boy remained awake, his gaze unwavering. He did not cry out, did not withdraw his arm, did not protest. He only stared, as if he had been waiting for them, as if this were a ritual he understood better than they did. It was Mrs. Fisk who finally broke the spell. "You are performing on a boy, doctor, not a cadaver." Her voice, though quiet, carried across the ward, cutting through the pupils, whispering pens. Hale dismissed her with a sharp, angry glance, but even he could not disguise the unease that was now settling over the room like a shroud. By midnight, the dozing logs were filled with contradictory, nonsensical observations. Insensible, written beside lucid. Pulse steady beside unresponsive reflex. The contradictions multiplied until the charts themselves seemed unreliable, a ledger unable to hold the truth of what the witnesses had seen. The very tools of their science, observation, documentation, were failing them. The cone was removed at last, the gauze damp and reeking of the sweet, sickly vapor. The boy inhaled once, a sharp, clean breath, then settled back into the same even rhythm he had carried upon entering the hospital weeks before. His eyes, never dulled by the chemical fog, closed at last on their own as if in simple, ordinary sleep. Dr. Hale set down the empty vial, his hand lingering for a moment on the cool glass. He could not write success in the log, for the boy had never been subdued. Nor could he admit failure, for that would be an admission of his own limitations. What remained was something far worse, a defiance not of man's will but of nature's laws. The body on the cot was a living refutation of his science. An anger, cold and sharp, began to curdle within him, an intellectual fury directed at this silent, inexplicable child. The boy's stillness was no longer passive. It felt like a judgment. If the vapor could not silence him, if the knife could not mark him, then perhaps an older, more elemental force would. The next experiment would not be one of chemistry or surgery. It would be a trial by water, an attempt to measure the very limits of breath and life. Hale was determined to find a breaking point. What he did not yet understand was that this boy's body seemed to have none. The zinc tub was carried into the surgical ward under the pretense of hygiene. Patients, especially the indigent, were occasionally washed, and so no one on the night staff questioned its arrival. Yet on that frigid winter night of 1864, its purpose was not for cleansing, but for measurement. The boy was guided toward it without a word of protest, his gray eyes steady, his frail body lowered into the icy water as though he were being settled into a shallow grave. Dr. Hale demanded absolute precision. A metronome was set on a small table beside the tub, its brass pendulum beginning to swing with a cold, mechanical indifference, each tick marking a second of stolen air. The pupils bent over their notebooks, their quills poised, prepared to capture the span of every breath, every heartbeat, every interval of stillness. The first trial was to be brief, a mere 30 seconds. The boy's head was pushed beneath the surface. The water, shockingly cold, made him gasp, and bubbles rose to the surface, catching the lamplight. When he was lifted, his lips were pale, a faint tremor running across his chest. He coughed once, expelling water, but his gaze returned to the ceiling without agitation or fear. The notes were recorded, no significant distress, pulse constant. The second trial was longer. 60 seconds ticked by against the relentless swing of the metronome's arm, each click an accusation in the silent room. This time, cyanosis bloomed faintly at the corners of the boy's mouth, a dusky, bruised blue that should have been warning enough. When he was lifted, his eyes opened at once, clear and unwavering. The pupils whispered over the contradiction. The physical symptoms of oxygen deprivation were present, yet his consciousness remained unaltered, his composure unbroken. This was not the panicked struggle of a drowning victim. It was something else, something terrifyingly serene. By the third trial, the water stilled around him as if waiting. 90 seconds elapsed. His face, submerged in the murky water, sank into a gray stillness. His chest no longer made any effort to rise. The pupils leaned forward in a mixture of dread and morbid fascination, one's hand already reaching for the linen sheet they used to cover the dead. A pulse was sought at his neck and found to be absent. Dr. Hale ordered him lifted from the tub. The boy's head lolled to the side, his body limp, lifeless. The metronome ticked on, marking a time the body no longer seemed to keep. The senior pupil opened his mouth to declare the time of death. And then came the cough. It was violent, convulsive, a sound that ripped through the clinical silence of the ward. A great gush of water was expelled across the floorboards. His chest rose again with a shuddering, ragged rhythm, and a steady, regular pulse returned beneath the nurse's trembling fingers. The notes were revised, lines crossed out with frantic strokes, new words scribbled in the margins with unsteady pens. Cyanosis observed, apparent cessation of vitals, recovery spontaneous. Hale, his face a mask of grim determination, refused to let the demonstration stand incomplete. He was not merely observing, he was pushing, searching for the absolute limit. He demanded another trial. The intervals stretched longer, the pendulum swing becoming an unbearable, hypnotic torment. 2 minutes, 2.5. Each attempt ended in the same maddening cycle, a stillness that mimicked death, followed by a recovery that defied all medical explanation. By the fifth trial, even the most hardened pupils struggled to write. One whispered that the metronome's tick had become a curse, its steady, inhuman beat mocking the hospital's fragile certainty. Mrs. Fisk, the matron, had turned away during the last submersion. She could not bear the sight of the child's thin body, limp against the water's surface, mouth open in silence, only to be brought back again with a pulse as unyielding as stone. "Stop this, doctor," Mrs. Fisk finally pleaded, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and outrage. "This is not medicine." Hale dismissed her with a single clipped word: documentation. But the documentation itself was becoming a testament to his failure. The pupils' notebooks were filled with phrases that fought each other on the page. Under termination of pulse came revival. Under apparent death came spontaneous recovery. Their handwriting grew erratic, frantic, as though the very act of recording what they were seeing had become complicit in the violation. The neat lines of their ledgers could not contain the chaos of the event. At Hale's command, a second, private set of notes was kept. The timings were copied carefully, but the official log was cleansed of its most damning contradictions, its most unbelievable observations. The public record would be sanitized. The private one held the terrifying truth. The zinc tub was finally emptied at dawn, the water poured away as if it could carry the night's sins with it. The metronome, still ticking, was at last stilled by a pupil with a trembling hand. In the ward's hushed, superstitious aftermath, no one dared touch it again. The boy slept quietly in his cot, his chest rising and falling with the same measured rhythm as before, as though nothing had been attempted at all. His pulse, when checked one last time by a shaken nurse, remained unchanged, faithful to its tempo, indifferent to water and to time. The experiment had failed. Water could not claim him. But Hale's obsession was only deepening. If the body's need for air could be defied, perhaps its need for sustenance could not. In the gray, frozen days of February 1864, the zinc tub was pushed into a storage closet, and a new, quieter experiment began. This one required no instruments, no chemical vapors, no dripping faucets. It required only the simple, brutal denial of bread. The trial was framed in the official hospital ledger as a nutritional study, the sort that city orphanages and asylums quietly supplied material for when bodies were cheap and their voices were easily ignored. It was a scientifically sanctioned form of cruelty, a slow, methodical dismantling of a human being, all in the name of progress. The boys' rations were reduced with clinical precision. Half portions became quarter portions. Gruel was thinned with water until it was little more than a cloudy memory of grain. The large chalkboard in the ward's corner, where the weights of recovering patients were tallied each morning, was wiped clean. A new chart was drawn, with the boys' name space left tellingly blank. A neat diagonal line was already forming in the physician's mind, a predictable trajectory of decline. Every child deprived of food should shrink at a measurable rate, their flesh and bone conceding to the cold arithmetic of starvation. At first, the boy's body seemed to obey. During the first week's measures, the chalk line on the board dipped downward as expected, his face hollowed, the skin stretching taut over his cheekbones. His frame seemed to collapse inward, like a tent stripped of its poles. He grew thinner, quieter, a ghost haunting the edges of the ward. And yet, each morning when his pulse was taken by a nervous pupil, it remained steady, a defiant, metronomic beat in a body that was visibly wasting away. The rhythm of his heart refused to acknowledge the famine imposed upon his cells. By the second week, the chalk line on the board faltered. Instead of continuing its steep descent, it wavered, climbing slightly one day, then holding perfectly level the next. The pupils, confounded, accused one another of feeding him in secret, of slipping him a crust of bread or a spoonful of broth when the matron wasn't looking. But Mrs. Fisk, her face grim, swore on her own conscience that nothing had passed his lips beyond what the charts allowed. She watched him now with a protective, fearful eye, her earlier unease curdling into a kind of horrified awe. Dr. Hale grew obsessed with the numbers on the chalkboard. He would stand before it late at night, a single lantern casting the graph in harsh, skeletal relief. A starving boy should vanish predictably. His body should consume itself. Yet this one resisted the fundamental mathematics of famine. His ribs sharpened into stark ridges beneath his skin. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets, but his heart ticked on with unwavering, impossible regularity. The metronome that had haunted the drowning trials no longer ticked in the corner, but Hale swore he could sometimes hear it all the same, beating now from within the boy's chest, a rhythm that starvation could not silence. The silence of the ward itself grew unbearable. Other children, when deprived, often whimpered with hunger. The sounds of their empty stomachs would growl audibly, their small cries filling the long hours between the meager meals. The boy, however, remained silent. He never complained, never begged, never showed any sign of distress. One night, a nurse recorded a strange, chilling observation in her margin notes. Her handwriting was small and nervous. "He listens to us count." She explained later to Mrs. Fisk that when the pupils recited his pulse aloud, 72, 73, 74, his eyes would flick upward, as if he were following the cadence, memorizing their voices as faithfully as he memorized the beat itself. By the third week, his skin hung from his frame in loose folds. He was a skeleton draped in parchment, yet his lips did not crack and his breath remained smooth and even. The pupils noted the paradox in their ledgers, their clinical language straining to describe the impossible, visible wasting without vital decline, cachexia without collapse. The chalkboard showed what no medical textbook could explain, a line that stalled, that bent, that refused to obey the hand that drew it. The matron, Mrs. Fisk, grew increasingly uneasy with the cruelty of the experiment. She whispered to another nurse that starvation was a punishment fit for a prison, not a study for a hospital. Dr. Hale overheard her and reminded her sharply that science had no place for sentiment. But even his own handwriting in his private journal began to shift, growing harsher, more angular, as the days passed without the result he demanded. By the fourth week, the pupils were instructed to weigh him twice daily, as though sheer repetition might conjure the proof they needed, as though the scales could be bullied into telling the right story. But the numbers never aligned with the body they touched. Frail, papery, and cold, yet still alive, still regular, still impossibly resistant. The ledger from that month survives only in fragments, the chalked figures copied onto paper, the margins smudged with what looks like frustrated charcoal. One faint line is erased halfway through the week. The absence speaks louder than the marks themselves, as though someone grew afraid of the permanence of what they had drawn. The boy endured not with strength but with something far more disturbing, an endurance stripped of all visible means. His pulse was not a sign of resilience but of refusal. Famine had failed. A new trial was needed, one that would not ask the body to consume itself but would consume it from the outside. If starvation failed, fire would be tested next. The fasting had left the boy wasted to the eye, a fragile collection of bones held together by translucent skin. But Dr. Hale, his patience worn thin and his scientific pride deeply wounded, insisted the next trial proceed immediately. Starvation had not bent the boy's will. Water had not broken his body. Chloroform had not silenced his consciousness. It was time, Hale declared to his assembled pupils, to see how the flesh received fire. The procedure he chose was cautery, an accepted and common tool of 19th century surgery. It was employed to stem uncontrolled bleeding on the battlefield, to burn away infected tissue, or to close amputations. Here, however, it was stripped of all therapeutic utility. It was transformed into a pure test, an application of sheer destructive heat. The boy was given a draught of laudanum, the thick, bitter tincture of opium poured from a bottle already stained at its cork. He swallowed the dose without complaint, his lips closing over the glass rim as though obedience were an automatic, ingrained reflex. In the corner of the ward, the instruments were prepared. A slender iron rod, its tip shaped into a small, flat disc, was heated in a portable brazier until it glowed a dull, menacing red. The acrid smell of coal smoke mixed with the ward's usual chemical tinctures, filling the air with a stifling, medicinal sweetness. Mrs. Fisk stood in the shadows, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. It might have been a prayer forming there, but it never broke into words. She had become a silent witness, her complicity a heavy weight in the quiet room. When the glowing iron hissed into contact with the boy's forearm, a sound escaped, not from him but from the flesh itself. A sharp, sickening sear like wet paper meeting a hot flame. His body did not thrash. His eyes, which had been open, closed briefly, then opened again. Calm, steady, watching. The iron was lifted away, leaving behind a perfect, coin-sized wound. It was a blistered, angry circle, its edges a stark white, its center raw and weeping clear fluid. Every textbook, every ounce of medical experience dictated that such an injury should crust over, fester, and persist for days, if not weeks, before slowly healing into a puckered, permanent scar. The pupil's notes were entered with meticulous precision. Application, 2 seconds. Location, ventral forearm. Analgesia, laudanum administered. They sketched the angry red ring in their notebooks, annotating its inflamed border, marking the expected phases of suppuration, contraction, and scarring. Dr. Hale instructed them to record hourly changes, confident that time itself would finally provide the measure he needed. Flesh, when burned, obeyed certain laws. It could not simply refuse. But by dawn, the wound had already begun to disobey. The weeping stopped. The blister, instead of breaking, seemed to reabsorb into the skin. The angry red color faded, and the crust that should have formed contracted into a thin pink seam, as faint as a month-old scar. The pupils redrew their sketches, erasing the blistered, weeping circle with disbelief. Their charts, neat, predictable progression, day 1, day 2, day 3, had collapsed into a single, impossible night. By the following evening, even the pink seam was gone. Smooth, undamaged skin stretched across the place where fire had pressed its searing brand only hours before. The faint line from the suture thread, applied during the very first experiment weeks ago, still lingered on his opposite arm. It had outlasted the mark of a heated iron. The official log recorded what could not be denied, though the language was carefully neutral. One pupil wrote, "Edges cohere beyond expectation." Another, in a smaller, cramped hand at the bottom margin, added a chilling, ambiguous phrase, "By permission." The phrase was underlined once, then quickly and nervously crossed out, as though the admission itself endangered not just the experiment, but the writer's own sanity and reputation. Dr. Hale did not speak as he examined the boy's arm again that night. He turned it over and over under the lamplight, his fingers probing the skin, searching for any discoloration, any tenderness, some remnant of his work. There was nothing. His jaw tightened, and when he finally looked away from the boy's arm, his expression carried the weight not of scientific triumph, but of a creeping, profound dread. The boy was becoming less a subject than a threat to natural law, a threat to the very foundations of medicine, and a threat to the career of a surgeon who needed results grounded in the predictable physical world. This silent, gray-eyed child was making a mockery of his science. Mrs. Fisk refused to stand near the brazier again. She later confided to another nurse that the boy had not looked at Dr. Hale during the burning. He had looked directly at her. His gaze was steady, silent, and deeply accusatory. It was as though he knew she had prayed but had not spoken, and that her silence had been its own kind of consent, its own form of violence. The brazier was extinguished, and the cauterizing iron was set aside to cool. But in the ward's ledger, the entry remained like a brand that could not be scrubbed away. Fire had failed to leave its mark, but Hale was not yet finished. If a solid element like iron could not undo him, perhaps an invisible one could. Perhaps a force that traveled through wire, a power that could make a dead frog's leg twitch, could reach the boy's unnervingly steady heart. By March, a weary, superstitious tension had settled over the ward. The pupils had grown tired of the boy's unnerving silence and of the unbroken, metronomic pulse that seemed to mock their every effort. If fire could leave no mark on the surface, perhaps an invisible current could reach the body's engine where the iron had failed. The galvanic battery was brought in on a wheeled mahogany stand, its stack of copper and zinc plates and its coiled brass wires gleaming in the dim lamplight. It was a piece of equipment typically used in public lectures for dramatic demonstration, making a cadaver's hand stir with a spark, or causing a frog's leg to twitch in a ghastly imitation of life. Now, it was wheeled to the boy's cot with a grim seriousness that silenced even the most eager student. The air in the room thickened with the sharp, clean smell of ozone as the contacts were tested, small blue sparks popping and crackling as they leaped between the wires. The pupils arranged themselves around the cot, their notebooks open, quills ready. Dr. Hale stood at the head of the bed, his eyes narrowed not with simple cruelty but with a scientist's desperate, insatiable hunger for an answer. "If the heart obeys no scalpel," he told them, his voice low and intense, "perhaps it will obey the current." Electrodes, small metal discs wrapped in saline-soaked linen, were pressed against the boy's bare chest, one over the heart, another at the wrist. His skin, stretched thin over his ribs, did not flinch at the cold, wet contact. The battery was engaged with the turn of a crank. A faint, visible tremor ran across the boy's ribs, a shiver beneath the skin. The pulse, measured at his carotid artery by a trembling pupil, slowed to a perilous, fluttering hush. The students recorded the tracings, their pens scratching frantically, beats that faltered, intervals stretching dangerously, ominously long. The heart was failing, and then the current was released. At once the cadence returned. It was not the stumbling, arrhythmic struggle of a heart recovering from a profound insult. It was an instantaneous resumption of its steady, measured rhythm, as if a clockwork metronome had been wound and set in perfect motion again. There was no recovery period, only a return to the baseline. Hale, his expression hardening, ordered the trial repeated. He increased the strength of the current, cranking the handle further. Again, the pulse stilled. The tracings showed a flat line. The heart threatened a complete and final absence, and again, on release, it returned to its baseline as if nothing had occurred. Hushed, frantic arguments broke out among the pupils. One insisted the tracings proved a temporary suppression of rhythm, a textbook response. Another countered that the recovery was too precise, too rehearsed, as though the boy's heart would tolerate no other tempo but its own. The chalkboard was brought out again, and it soon filled with lines that told no human story. Pulses that fell silent, then rose again, not as a sign of recovery, but as an act of absolute refusal to be altered. Natural law cannot be pleaded with, Hale muttered as he studied the figures, his own words seeming to mock him, if it cannot first be made to falter. His remark was recorded in a student's margin notes, though it was later struck from the official minutes of the case. The trials continued deep into the night. The electrodes were shifted to his shoulder and temple, the current passed in short, sharp bursts, then in long, draining surges meant to exhaust the cardiac muscle. Each time, the boy's thin body trembled under the invisible, violent hand of the battery. Each time, the rhythm slackened, threatening cessation. And each time, when the wires were pulled away, the same impossible, maddening regularity returned, as if the heart obeyed a law older than medicine, older than flesh itself. Mrs. Fisk, watching from the ward's far corner, whispered to another nurse that it was like listening to a clock that refuses to be unwound. Her words never entered the official log, but the look of pure dread on her face lingered in the pupils, memories more than the tracings themselves. By dawn, the battery's plates had cooled, the gas lamps had guttered low, and the boy lay as he had before, gray-eyed, silent, his pulse steady beneath fingers too tired and too unnerved to continue counting. On the chalkboard, the frantic tracings ended with a final, terse line written in Hale's own hand, baseline reestablished. No arrhythmic drift. Electricity, like the knife, the vapor, the water, and the fire, had been refused. The body's exterior had proven impenetrable. Its internal mechanisms had proven immutable. The failures were mounting, each one more profound than the last, and Hale was left with a desperate final frontier. He had tried to break the body from the outside. Now he would try to undo it from within. The subject of transfusion, of exchanging blood, of borrowing life from one vessel to fill another, was still whispered about in the halls of medicine with a mixture of hope and horror. To some, it was the ultimate promise of healing. To others, it was blasphemy, a dark art that tampered with the very essence of life. For Dr. Hale, it was his last resort. If electricity could not silence the heart, perhaps the blood itself held the key. He would petition the hospital's committee, and this time he would not be denied. Dr. Hale's petition to the hospital's committee of visitors was a masterpiece of calculated clinical language. He knew the subject of blood transfusion was fraught with controversy and past failures. The memory of disastrous animal-to-human transfusions in Europe still lingered, tales of patients dying in convulsions, their blood turning black in their veins. So he framed his request carefully. He wrote of a cautious trial, a measured exchange, no more than a single pint. He described the subject as being otherwise without family or parish responsibility, a phrase that coded the boy as disposable. He called the situation a unique opportunity for scientific inquiry. He cited foreign journals from Paris and Vienna, carefully selecting cases where transfusion had been attempted, though he conveniently omitted the often fatal outcomes in his final draft. The committee received the request in their oak-paneled boardroom, a chamber where the portraits of stern-faced benefactors stared down with an air of unblinking, judgmental solemnity. The minutes from that meeting, recorded in the sterile, passive phrases of bureaucracy, document their hesitation. Words like controversial, risky, and imprudent appear in the neat, looping script of the secretary. They recalled the animal blood scandals of previous decades, the public outcry and the physicians in London and Paris who were left discredited, their careers in ruins. The war, they reasoned, already demanded too many bodies to justify a private experiment that might yield only scandal and public condemnation. When the final vote was called, the paper petition was stamped with a heavy final seal. The word, impressed in stark black ink, was a single, unambiguous syllable: no. Hale's frustration, however, did not end with the vote. He saw their denial not as a protection of the boy, but as a cowardly protection of the institution. The board had shielded itself with ink, not with conscience. Their refusal was a challenge. Denied the radical procedure of transfusion, Hale devised a grim compromise, one that required no committee approval because it fell within the bounds of accepted, if archaic, medical practice. The boy would be bled, not filled. Venesection, after all, was an ancient practice, taught to students as both a treatment for fevers and a diagnostic tool. A shallow incision at the crook of the arm, a measured flow of blood into a porcelain bowl. It was nothing that could not be explained away as a routine, if aggressive, treatment for an unknown ailment. On the night it was done, the pupils were instructed to record every drop. The bowl, stark white against the dark wood of the bedside table, filled slowly. The crimson surface quivered under the lamplight as though the blood itself were reluctant to leave the body. Hale ordered them to stop at the first visible signs of pallor, when the boy's skin took on a waxy, translucent quality and his lips faded to a bloodless gray. The boy swayed on the cot, but his eyes, though heavy-lidded, remained lucid. He watched them with a detached curiosity, his lips closed against any protest. A restorative protocol followed immediately. Warm broth, salted water, a spoon pressed between his teeth, fluids meant to simulate replenishment, to disguise the absence of what had been taken. The pupils prepared their charts, ready to mark the slow, predictable decline, to sketch the waning of strength that should always follow significant bloodletting. But the color returned to his face too quickly. His skin, ashen only moments before, regained its pale but living tone within the hour. The pulse, which had thinned to a weak, thready flutter during the bleeding, resumed its mechanical steadiness almost at once. By morning the boy was sitting upright in his cot, his face still pale but his rhythm unbroken. The bowl of blood, now cooled to a dull, congealed maroon, offered no answer but its own stillness. It was just blood, after all. Pupils' notes from that night betray their growing unease and confusion. The scientific method was failing them at every turn. One wrote in his log, "Pallor reversed in a time inconsistent with fluid loss." Another added, "Restoration protocols incomplete, yet vitals re-established without delay." Dr. Hale himself added nothing to the official chart. He left the space for his own observations conspicuously, accusingly blank. To record failure might be forgivable in the annals of medicine. To record impossibility was not. In the hospital archive, the original petition survives, the committee's stamped denial still stark and black against the page. No, but beneath it in the margin is a scrolled, cryptic remark in Hale's own spidery hand, almost illegible. "Law is not blood. Blood may be law." It is a line that reads less like a scientific observation and more like the beginning of a descent into obsession. The committee had thought a single word, a single stamp, could contain the case and protect the hospital. In truth, their refusal only pushed Hale further from the light of oversight and deeper into the shadows of his own fixation. If the institution's policies denied him, his own obsession would continue unchecked, in secret. But secrets, in a place as crowded as a hospital ward, have a way of whispering through the walls, and the whispers were beginning to be heard. By the spring of 1864, the case of the nameless boy could no longer be contained within the ward alone. Whispers had begun to travel through the hospital, carried by nurses and pupils from one floor to the next. They spoke of wounds that sealed overnight, of drownings that failed to drown, of a pulse that resisted even the violent jolt of a galvanic current. The stories were becoming a kind of institutional folklore, a ghost story told while the ghost was still breathing in a cot on the surgical floor. The committee of visitors, the guardians of the hospital's public face and its considerable reputation, could not ignore the rumors forever. They called a closed session to address what the official minutes termed matters of irregularity regarding a temporary ward patient. The meeting was held in the oak-paneled boardroom, where the portraits of benefactors stared down with their painted, somber gravity. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax polish, and the faint, acidic scent of ink. Minutes were taken in the studied, careful neutrality of a bureaucratic hand, the language smoothed and polished until it concealed more than it revealed. Words like propriety, prudence, and overreach appeared in neat succession, as though a well-chosen vocabulary might be enough to contain the spreading unease. Dr. Hale sat rigid at the long table, his notes clutched in his hand so tightly his knuckles were white. His pupils were not invited to attend. Their sketches and ledgers, filled with their frantic, contradictory observations, were already considered compromised, tainted by what the committee chairman called youthful hyperbole. Only Hale was asked to explain. His voice, at first clinical and detached, grew darker, more intense, as he described the boy's impossible endurance. The subject's body fails to comply with expected physiological trajectories, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. It does so with what I can only describe as a deliberate biological refusal. When pressed by a skeptical board member to clarify, he used a phrase that unsettled even his staunchest allies on the committee: noncompliance with natural law. The matron, Mrs. Fisk, was summoned next. She entered the boardroom nervously, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. She did not bring ledgers or charts, only her memory and the weight of her conscience. Her testimony was brief, hesitant, almost ashamed. "The child he endures too well," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She could not say more without sounding mad herself, without describing things that had no place in the rational, orderly world of a Boston hospital. Her phrase, "endures too well," was entered into the official minutes as if it were merely an observation of a patient's fortitude, stripped entirely of its dread, its sense of the unnatural. The committee's primary concern, it quickly became clear, was not the boy's welfare, but the hospital's standing. They spoke of liability, of reputation, of the scandal that would surely follow if word of such unorthodox and repeated trials reached the city's newspapers. They reminded Dr. Hale of the hospital's founding principles, invoking charity, decorum, and scientific restraint. Each word landed not as a guiding commandment, but as a sharp, personal rebuke. At last, the official guidance was drafted and written into the record: cease further trials until the matter can be clarified. The phrase was a piece of bureaucratic balm, designed to appear decisive while conceding nothing, promising a clarification that would never come. The document survives in the archive, stamped and signed, the ink as firm and resolute as the oak table on which it was written. But to Hale, the word cease was not a command. It was a provocation. He read it as hesitation, as cowardice dressed in the fine clothes of propriety. To him, the committee had not forbidden discovery. They had merely relinquished their claim to it. If they would not claim authority over the boy, then he alone must. He would conduct one final trial, one so definitive it would leave no room for doubt or denial. That evening, as the boardroom emptied and the portraits of the founders stared on into the silent, polished dark, Hale walked back into the ward. He carried the stamped guidance folded neatly in his coat pocket, its official ink unreadable to anyone who did not know how to mistrust paper. He did not tell his pupils that the committee had ordered a stop. Instead, he told them that preparations must be made for a conclusive trial, one that would finally provide an irrefutable answer. The zinc tub was returned to the ward, filled again with cold, murky water drawn from the hospital's system. Its surface shivered under the low gaslight. This time, there would be no 30 seconds, no 60, no 90. There would be no intervals counted aloud by nervous students. Hale had decided on a trial that would eclipse all the others, a single, sustained immersion designed to push the body past any conceivable point of return. The metronome, once the cold, impartial arbiter of these immersions, remained silent on its shelf. Instead, one pupil later recalled hearing the great cathedral clock on Park Street tolling in his mind, each imagined chime reverberating against the boy's still chest. The boy was lowered into the tub, his thin arms folding across his chest as if he were already prepared for his own burial. The water closed over his face with no struggle, no resistance. Seconds stretched into minutes. The cyanosis spread across his lips, and his skin paled to a ghostly bluish hue. The pupils exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. To halt the experiment now would mean defying Hale directly, and to defy Hale meant professional exile. This was the final test, not just for the boy but for them as well. At 4 minutes his chest lay utterly still beneath the water. Hale himself prepared a document, one he was certain he would finally get to use. While the boy lay submerged in the zinc tub, his body still and silent, Dr. Hale turned to the small desk at the back of the ward. He opened a folder that he had already prepared. Inside was a freshly drafted death certificate. His pen, dipped in black ink, hovered over the blank line where a name should have been. He was ready to finalize what every observation, every second of the immersion had now surely confirmed, that the boy had ceased to live. He would sign it, the committee be damned. He would have his conclusion, but just as his pen was about to touch the paper, a sound came from the tub. It began as a single, violent shudder, then a convulsive arching of the boy's thin frame. Water surged from his mouth, splattering across the floorboards. His chest heaved once, then again, dragging air back into lungs that had seemed extinguished for an eternity. A pulse was felt beneath a pupil's trembling fingers, at first rapid and chaotic, then steadying, then, impossibly, returning to the same regular metronomic beat as ever. The linen sheet that had been prepared to cover his face was quietly set aside. The pupil's notes were struck through, their hands shaking as they revised their entries, writing new words over the old, revival spontaneous after prolonged immersion. Hale said nothing. He stared at the boy, who now sat up in the tub, his gray eyes open with their usual unnerving clarity. He then looked down at the death certificate in his hand. The line for the name remained empty. He could not sign it, because the body it described refused to accept what the paper demanded. The certificate was folded and slipped back into the folder, a document both written and unwritten, a record of a death that no one could sign. It would later become the most damning artifact in the boy's file, a declaration of mortality prepared in advance, but undone by the body's absolute refusal to comply. This created a new, unforeseen crisis. A medical paradox was one thing, an administrative one was another. Death certificates required names. Burial records required parish letters. Hospital registers required intake and discharge entries that matched. Without such things, a body could not be moved, let alone buried. The boy's survival had already undone every clinical certainty. Now his namelessness began to unravel the very paper system that held the institution together and protected it from chaos. The clerks worked by candlelight in the record room, hunched over massive ledgers whose ruled lines stretched on like silent, unbending commandments. Each page demanded completion. Intake on the left, discharge or death on the right. The boy's line stood vacant, the ink around it scratched and half erased, a smudge that looked more like an admission of defeat than a clerical error. One clerk, in a desperate attempt to solve the problem, tried assigning him a borrowed surname taken from a family recently discharged. It was penciled in lightly above the blank space. By the next morning the word was gone, rubbed away with a bit of stale bread until only the gray, disturbed fibers of the paper remained. Other attempts followed. Initials were tried, J.H., then S.C. Letters that might have stood for anything or nothing. Each was soon crossed out, reduced to a single dash, then rubbed into near invisibility. The space left behind seemed more accusing than the initial blank had been, as though the boy himself were resisting inscription from beyond the ward. The mortuary book, a separate ledger reserved for the dead, presented the same insoluble problem. Under the heading for March 1864, a clerk left an open line, meant to be filled once the boy's case was finally, inevitably closed. The line was never completed. Later pages for April and May continued without it. The ruled gap it left behind became a testament to something the institution could not name and therefore could not bury. It was an administrative ghost, a void in the official story. The hospital had long relied on parish customs and city ordinances to resolve such gaps. Orphans were usually given asylum surnames, crude inventions derived from the streets they were found on, the trades they were born into, or the benefactors who had financed their ward. A boy might become John Tremont after Tremont Street, or Samuel Storrow after the donor who had paid for the surgical theater. But in this case, every attempt to name him, to pin him to the page, collapsed under erasure. It was not simple oversight. It felt like a deliberate, active resistance. The names were written, then methodically removed as if each one were deemed unfit for permanence. When a child died without known kin, it was customary for the ward matron to preside over a small set of prayers. Mrs. Fisk was asked to do so, a routine courtesy to close the books on a soul. She flatly refused. "I cannot read a prayer over a ledger mark," she told the hospital chaplain, her words later recalled by a nurse. "There must be a name or the prayer is nothing." Her refusal left the boy without blessing, without record, suspended between the file and the flesh. For the clerks, this was more than a moral unease. It was an administrative cruelty. Without a name, there could be no discharge, no transfer, no burial, no certificate of death. He became a living contradiction, not only in biology but in paperwork. A body alive enough to resist a final entry, yet institutionally dead enough to demand one. The clerks scratched and erased until their pages looked wounded, the ruled lines breaking under the weight of their hesitation. What survives in the archive is this absence as evidence. Gaps, dashes, and erasures where words should be. The boy was transformed not into a memory, but into a vacancy. The hospital, unable to explain him or to end him, was left with only one option: to bury him not in the ground but in silence. In the hospital's archives, some records end not with signatures and resolutions, but with an abrupt, unsettling silence. The boy's case is among them. The daily entries, once written with such clinical, obsessive rigor, the pulse counts, the wound sketches, the dosing tables, halt mid-sentence. A half-finished figure remains on the final chart, the number 7 followed by a faint tail of ink, as though the clerk's hand had been physically lifted from the page before the final digit could be completed. The ink fades, drying without closure. No addendum follows. No summary of the case is offered. The space beneath is starkly, unnervingly blank. A week later, a new, neater hand returned to the main ward ledger and added a single terse phrase in the margin beside the boy's empty line: "Case discontinued." There was no date of discharge, no reason given, only those two words. To discontinue was not to resolve, only to abandon. It was an admission of defeat disguised as an administrative action. The physical ward began to reflect the same decision. The lock was changed on the door to the far bay of the surgical floor where the boy's cot had been kept. It was now sealed to junior nurses and all of Hale's pupils. Those who had been assigned to his watch were quietly reassigned to other wards, to the consumption cases, the fever wards, the ordinary, understandable tragedies of the institution. The pupils who had drawn his charts and counted his pulse were told nothing, only that their attention was now required elsewhere. The hospital itself adjusted its geography to conceal him. When wealthy benefactors toured the wards, their paths were carefully rerouted. The locked bay was always bypassed. Visitors were shown the gleaming surgical instruments, the clean, orderly rows of recovering patients, and the charts that always resolved in either cure or death. No one was guided past the place where the boy still lay. His steady pulse a silent rebellion against the official record that had now declared him non-existent. The silence was not accidental. It was manufactured, constructed with the same precision as one of Hale's experiments. Mrs. Fisk, the ward matron, recognized the act for what it was: a burial by omission. No prayer had been said, no certificate had been signed, but the institution, in its quiet, bureaucratic way, had declared him erased. His case no longer belonged to medicine, but to secrecy. For the hospital, it was safer this way. An absence could not be questioned. A discontinued case could not be cross-examined in a medical journal. Silence preserved a reputation in a way that science could not. But not every record of the boy was meant for the official archive. Some were written in secret, under the flickering light of a candle, by hands that trembled more from conscience than from cold. One such account, a letter, came from a nurse whose name is preserved only in fragments. She sat at a small writing desk in the small hours of the morning, her quill scratching across a rough sheet of paper. She did not frame her words as an accusation, nor as a complaint. The letter was written as a confession, addressed to a parish priest she knew in the North End. She did not name the boy, for she could not. She only begged for prayers for a child without name who will not die, though every trial is laid upon him. Her handwriting wavered across the page, drifting between clinical restraint and raw desperation. She described the cautery iron, how its wound had sealed into smooth skin by morning. She recalled the drowning trials where water had filled his lungs, and yet he rose again, his pulse as steady as the priest's own chapel bell. She admitted her own complicity during the fasting, standing beside a boy reduced to paper and bone, waiting for him to collapse and recording only that he did not. The letter was a plea for absolution. "I beg you, Father," she wrote, "give him a name in your prayers that his soul may not be left to ledger marks alone." But the letter was never posted. At some point, whether out of fear or shame, it was folded not into an envelope, but into a hospital minute book, hidden between the pages that recorded the committee's own sanitized decisions. It remained there unread for over a century, a secret heart beating within the official body of the archive. Decades later, when every witness had gone to dust and the hospital itself had grown into new wings of brick and steel, the boy returned, not in flesh, but in paper. It happened in an archive room where an archivist, tasked with indexing routine minutes, opened a volume that had not been touched in generations. Between decisions about heating allowances and supply inventories, the nurse's folded letter slipped free. Tucked with it were other fragments: Hale's denied petition, a copy of the unsigned death certificate, and a transcription of the most chilling line from his private notebook. "We could not kill him. We could not explain him. We could only stop." The fragments told a story the institution had tried to dissolve. A boy who endured incision, vapor, water, famine, fire, and current. A boy erased from every ledger but present in every absence. The record stopped not because the subject was resolved, but because the institution could no longer risk continuing. What happened to the boy after the ledgers went silent? No one can say. No discharge papers were ever filed. No grave marker bears his story. What remains is not a life or a death, but a refusal of chloroform, of water, of fire, of paper itself. The final words in the discovered file were not from a doctor or a nurse. They were added decades later in the faint, shaky pencil of another archivist who had clearly found these same papers long ago. A postscript at the bottom of the last empty page. Faint, but undeniable. It read, "He is still healing." What do you believe happened to the boy of Massachusetts General? Was he a medical anomaly, a miracle, or something else entirely? Tell us your theory in the comments below. And if this story unsettled you, subscribe for more journeys into history's most disturbing corridors.